Hello and good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone today to our webinar, Key Aspects of Ketosis and Nutrient Mobilization of Dairy Cows in the Early Postpartum Period. The webinar today is brought to you by Wycenex, and I'm Dr. Mark Thomas, and I'll be your host today. It's a pleasure today to have a great reference on this subject, Dr. Luciano Cachetta, who's a colleague and friend and an assistant professor of dairy production medicine at the University of Minnesota. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for being here today, and I would like to thank our guest, Dr. Luciano Cachetta. His presence is really important, and we'll have a wealth of knowledge that'll be delivered today that'll be invaluable to everyone who is tuning in. So thanks so much for joining. Thanks again for your presence, the time you're taking today, and your trust in our program. We'd like you all to feel very free to participate, but if you put questions in the chat, and then at the end we'll have ample time for questions and answers with Dr. Cachetta. So let's start with a brief introduction of our guest today, Dr. Luciano Cachetta, and then get on with the program. Luciano grew up within a family of dairy practitioners in Brazil. After obtaining his veterinary degree in the country of his birth, he then relocated to the United States to pursue further academic education and training. He first completed a production medicine residency and then earned his PhD at Cornell University. And then his first faculty position was a clinical instructor of dairy population health management at Colorado State University. After 2 years there, he then joined the Dairy Production Medicine group at the University of Minnesota. As a practitioner, Dr. Cachetta consistently encountered the direct and indirect consequences of metabolic issues, such as ketosis, DA, and all the transition diseases that we all know too well. And that has led him to develop a keen interest in enhancing the understanding of metabolic adaptations of periparturient dairy cattle. So with that, let's get right on to Dr. Cachetta's presentation. Welcome, Luciano.
Thank you, Mark. See, I'm there. I see my screen and everything moving here. So thanks, Mark, and thanks for the introduction. Does explain where I come from and like why I have interest in ketosis. And this topic, it's interesting because before I had the title for the presentation has been before just like ketosis or hyperkalemia, and those are key aspects of it that I'll be showing today. And I'll just like to start by giving you a brief outline for all of you watching this webinar. I divided the presentation into two different parts. In the first part, we're going to have like the classic review of hyperketonemia, some physiology definitions and testing methods. And this is, I think it's very important because I'll try to summarize here in this presentation what is being used and should be the gold standard of hyperketonemia and ketosis on farms right now. And then on the second part, I'll go over some new concepts, and I'm biased to those because those are work that we've been doing here in my group here in Minnesota through some of the questions and some of the concerns that we got and were brought to us by practitioners and by producers. So that's basically outlined. So we'll be very within the timeline. So very being mindful of your own time too. So to start, this is not new to anyone. The transition period is something very important, and we have been and traditionally has been defined as the 3 weeks before to the 3 weeks after parturition. But because of all the different management changes and also the different physiology and metabolism that the cows have, I personally like to incorporate all the dry periods. So if you look here, what I have, we go all the way from 60 or 45, depending on what's the dry period they're using, all the changes that happen during the dry period, the fresh cows, and up to the point that we deliver a cow to the end of voluntary waiting period, so she can be bred. So I like to look at it this way, and it's important and caught my attention as a researcher and as a practitioner, because most of the diseases I was treating happened during this period, and most of the problems that will happen to a cow and potentially decrease their production will happen early on. So this is what was a little bit against job security, but it's just like working on preventing those, since by preventing it and not letting it happen, it's something that's much more beneficial to the farm and to the cows. So I like to think as myself, by doing this, being a fire marshal, putting protocols in place, avoiding any of the fires to happen, so I don't have to go there as a firefighter and put it away and have all that damage done already. So that's what I think. It's very important period on the adult cow. This is my opinion, the most important period of the lactation cycle. So some things to keep in mind in here. And one of the reasons it is extremely challenging to all the producers and the cows is because it's a period when in the in the 2 days from like the day before they calve to the day right after they calve, they have a huge increase in their nutrient demands. So those cows they are in a negative nutrient balance or a nutrient deficit, and just things that have been well studied and has been actually measured, you can go here and see there's a 300% increase in the energy demand and a 65% increase in calcium requirements. And those are, I keep it close to heart, because those are some things that will lead to the hyperketonemia, which we'll talk today, and hypocalcemia, which is another topic that I have studied through the years. And then just as to drill down really well what this means, it is a cow in those 2 days. This analogy, I'm borrowing it from Dr. Neidham, who borrowed it from someone else, but it's very impactful to understand. It's in 2 days, we have a cow equivalent of energy of doing nothing on a couch to running up to 2 marathons a day. So that's how much the energy demand of those cows and nutrient demands for those cows to survive are, and super fast. So which means that they have to really adapt on the dime and like pump up all that energy, all those minerals to maintain their immune response and sustain their milk production. So if you want to put some numbers, Dr. Drakely has published a couple years ago some of those numbers, and you can see here, if you look into a cow pre-partum versus postpartum, and let's focus here on the total energy that they need, they'll have like to double here. So they basically double their requirements for both the cow and the heifer, not as much, but it's pretty close. So it's very important for us to take care of those animals because they are in a very challenging period of their lactation cycle. And then, as I said, they need a lot of energy, they need a lot of nutrients. So if you think just about energy, one of the ways that they can supplement or supply all this energy required for maintaining the regular milk production and all the functions of the body is by mobilizing fat. So this, again, nothing new to anyone. They mobilize a lot of the adipose tissue as DFA, so non-esterified fatty acids, which would be circulating in blood, and that can be used as a alternative source of energy for this animal. So part of it is taken up by the mammary gland, and we have like this preformed fat. So that's why if you look into milk composition for those cows in your herd, the early lactation cows will have a higher milk fat content compared to later on. And if you were going a little deeper, and we have technology that we can use to do it now, but if you go there and analyze what of that fat was produced in the mammary gland and what is preformed and they just absorbed by the mammary gland. You see in the early lactation, you have a lot of this preformed fat just coming from the back of the cows, pretty much. But most important, here is just trying to explain what we have been talking, and we're going to talk because it leads us to the BHB, the ketone bodies. So this fat can be used by the cow to produce energy and not have any partial oxidation. So it produce energy for the animal and for the liver so they can use it. But a lot of it is diverted because some of the other pathways are overwhelmed to the production of ketone bodies. And then this is what we measure in blood to determine if a cow have hyperketonemia or not. And then we'll discuss here, and I'm happy to discuss further about is it a disease or is it just a disorder. It'll be very clear to you at the end that I'm on the camp of that this is a disorder. It could be a disease, but for the most part, it's a disorder. It's something that the cows have and live with, and we just have to learn how to manage it. But for completeness here, if we have too much mobilization of fat and it's overwhelming, we can have some accumulation of this as triglycerides in the liver. That's why we have those fatty liver. If any of you had the chance to necropsy a fresh cow that died, or peek into the incision of a DA of this fresh cow, if you look at her liver, it's much bigger than it usually is because it gets enlarged to produce all that glucose that the cow needs. And you can see that you have some fat accumulation. So it looks a little yellow, not the very maroon-like color that we will find on supermarket liver. So it's very distinct, and it's because it's accumulating. And the cows have a very good capacity of actually getting most of them, getting rid of this fat once their energy requirements are met afterwards, and they start cleaning up that liver onwards. But most important here is BHB, and this ketone bodies has been used and studied a lot as a proxy for this negative energy balance or deficit, and it's something that we measure very often, and multiple farms will be measuring it and making decisions on treatment on cows or different management of animals. So very important, and has had a lot of different groups have studied it, and a lot of recommendations came out. So that's why we're trying to give a update here, and like I said, get you some sort of a gold standard based on the literature we have so far. So as a definition, hyperketonemia or ketosis is just the increase in blood, urine, or milk of these ketone bodies. And if you have different fluids, you're going to have different ketone bodies we are measuring. So, for example, acetoacetate would be most likely to be measured in urine, and you have beta hydroxybutyrate or BHB that we usually measure in blood. There's a way to measure in urine and also in milk. But we use those to determine if the cow has, based on epidemiological data, too much or not too much. And historically, different classifications, but lately we been using the subclinical and clinical classification, with subclinical being blood BHB greater than 1.2 and up to 2.9. So this is like the cutoffs and the events that we often see in protocols. You go to a farm, and if you're testing blood, cow that has blood BHB greater than 1.2 should be treated for ketosis. But in some cases, if a cow has a blood BHB greater than 3, which is then the clinical cases, should also be treated for ketosis, but in this case, you have a different treatment. And I'll go over which treatments go for clinical and subclinical based on literature, but just giving, again, some importance why do we care about this problem is hyperketonemia has been associated with decreased milk production, poor reproductive performance, increased occurrence of other diseases, and increased chances of leaving the herd. And that has been done and repeated and confirmed by different research groups in different parts of the country and even in other parts of the planet, which is pretty consistent to what we have. And here, just describing how it is, like if you were to count all the cows here, you see that there's about 20% of the cows are this orange color, which would be considered to have high BHB. And if you're measuring BHB, for example, once a week at a farm, at least here in the upper Midwest, 20% will be pretty consistent. You're going to find pretty consistently that 20% of the cows will have high BHB. But even though we know all these consequences and these potential problems that are associated with hyperketonemia, we still go to farms and we talk to producers, talk to the fresh cow team, and ask them what they do about ketosis, or they come to us and say, like, this cow, I measure her BHB and I'm treating her for ketosis because it was above 1.2, but she doesn't look sick. She's one of the best milking cows. I don't think she has a disease. And that's why I mentioned before, I agree with that line of thought that this is actually not a disease, a disorder. It's something that we're finding on cows, but it's not totally or always leaving or taking it to a disease state. The cows might not need a treatment at that point, and that's something that we have been working on in the past few years here in Minnesota. So also has been described by Dr. McCart that the prevalence or the incidence of ketosis, it's more, it have a higher incidence in the first week. So if we were here, if you look on the y-axis is the first positive test of BHB, and by x-axis the days in milk, you find that on day 5 is when they found most of the cows have their first BHB case, high BHB case. And the way they did it, they went to farm, collect hundreds of cows every day from day 3 to day 16. They all have a blood taken every day. And then they just plotted here, like when did they find their first? And then here we see is about on day 5, which is something very interesting because if you are trying to implement some ways of monitoring these BHB levels at your farm, if you are within around day 5, that's when you should be targeting your date to be testing those animals. You see here, when we start going further past the first week, the incidence or the first test is much lower. And then if you're truly trying to find all the cows that have high BHB during their early lactation, you'll be missing a lot of animals here. So it also leads to some of the data we're going to show in the future why first week high BHB in first week is something that should be more mindful than what happens in the second week. Ways to do it, there are different ways people use. Blood ketone bodies is something that we often use on the research and in some farms that have the capability of bleeding cows, just because the ketones in the blood, especially BHB, is very stable. So it's a very accurate test. It has been validated for those animals, and it's fairly inexpensive to perform. However, if you have a urine ketone body with keto sticks or even the powder, it's even cheaper, and you can also find cows. So you'll be measuring a different ketone body, but it's still, you have a pretty accurate and a pretty good idea of what's happening on the cows having ketosis or not within your herd. So just an example, this was some extension work done by Dr. Clips Galvan in Florida that they were comparing if we use the blood test versus using the urine test, which is something that many farms use because it's cheaper. So they were just comparing, can I instead of using the more expensive, more laborious blood test, use a urine test to find cows that potentially have high BHB, even though we know we're measuring a different ketone body. And making this complicated table, summarizing, making simple, is if you look at it, if they have any trace, so if they start changing any colors, we are have a good sensitivity and a good specificity, which means like we are not misclassifying or missing a lot of the positive cows by using a trace as the level that we use on the keto sticks. So it can be done using keto urine BHB, but we're gonna get to more discussion on like, do we need to test all cows and what not later in this presentation. And as I mentioned before, I would like to say and talk a little bit about what has been the gold standard treatment for those cows based on that classification we had on clinical and subclinical cases. I'll start first here with the left panel, the right panel here. So if you look at the subclinical cases, which is the vast majority of the cases you're going to find at farms, they have high BHB, but not extremely high. The treatment that's recommended is 10 ounces, 300 ml of propylene glycol orally from between 3 and 5 days. Many farms will opt for 3 days because after 3 days, those cows are, even if they're sick in the first day, they don't feel sick in the last day, and they don't want to get propylene glycol orally the last 2 days. Makes it really hard, and usually by the end of the 3-day course, cows are doing fairly well. And I usually recommend also a vitamin B12 just to enhance the appetite for those animals, which is fairly easy. On the other hand, now on the left panel, if you have clinical cases, which are the cows that have really high BHB, those are animals that actually need a lot of glucose. And the reason they have this BHB is just because they don't have enough energy. They have all this, they might have some need for glucose there. So we recommend to give them dextrose solution, which is basically just pure glucose that you put in IV, half a bottle or a bottle, depends on your situation. If you have multiple cows that you treat in a day, if you want to give half a bottle, that's okay. But if you have one cow that you're treating a day, you can give the whole bottle, and it's not going to change much of the results, but it's definitely important for those cows that are in the clinical state. They need really fast glucose to give them the dextrose, and then you follow with the same 300 ml of propylene glycol and vitamin B for the next 3 days. So you do the clinical part, the shock treatment, and then you do the supportive treatment, which is what we did for those subclinical cases. And here, just to show, because there's a lot of questions, practitioners and producers, if we need to give dextrose to all cows. And there's still some farms that are treating ketosis, any ketose with a bottle of dextrose. So this work was just led by Dr. McCart at Cornell with Dr. Mike Capel at Perry Vet Clinic. They tested this question, do we need to give dextrose to all cows? So they have 3 groups. The first group, if they have high BHB, they'll have just that standard treatment, 300 ml or 10 ounces of propylene glycol for 3 days. A second group, they'll have 300 ml of propylene glycol, 10 ounces for 3 days, plus 1 bottle of dextrose in the first day, IV. And a third group, they test, we'll give the propylene glycol treatment, the 10 ounces, and we're going to get dextrose every day. So they were basically testing, do we need to have give dextrose? Does the dextrose IV help? So what their results were that there's no improvement in the resolution of hyperketonemia by inducing or by including that dextrose IV for 3 days or even for 1 day. There's no reduction on any of the adverse events during the first days, and there was no difference in the average milk production for the first 10 weeks in lactation. So this is yet another trial showing that there's no evidence that giving this dextrose to cows that are not nervous ketotics, cows that are not down and really in need for glucose right away, there's no evidence that giving dextrose IV will enhance any of the production outcomes. So basically what I was just saying, like if your treatment for your cows with high BHB is to give IV dextrose, you might need to rethink it. There's not enough scientific evidence to support that, and it's a lot of work, and it will be potentially definitely not detrimental, but you're taking the cow away from her regular cow life for a little bit to provide this IV treatment. So other things to think about, and this has been published for 20 years now, and it's just if you want to know, and there is still place for this regular monitoring of BHB of cows, and it's just a sample of cows on your fresh pen in the first week, and I'll say here that the date should be between 3 and 9 days in milk, and you check what's the BHB levels. And the reason we do that is just to make sure that the cows are transitioning well and they're not mobilizing too much fat that could be a problem to them. So what we want to be is it within this less than 15% of the cows having BHB, which usually give us an idea that yes, they're doing well and they're transitioning fairly well into lactation, and it's not a problem. Then if you start seeing more of them up to 40%, you might need to monitor a little more. And basically what these tests are doing, if you're not very on the 15, 20% or lower hyperketonemia, you should be looking into your dry cow diet management, stocking density, heat abatement that we're getting at. Like, is there something happening to those cows in the dry period that's leading them to not adapt well to our transition? So our fresh pan and lactation. So what we're trying to see is like, can we monitor and can we find out when we are having some issues to make sure we can implement changes to have decrease the incidence of those problems. Basically, with that, keeping in mind that by finding out today that we have too much and we need to do something, we're going to make changes likely in the dry cow pen. That'll take us like 2 or 3 weeks to see any reasonable effects based on the changes we implemented today. But this gives us a good idea of what's happening to the cows transitioning. Are we doing a good job on maintaining them the way we expect it to be? So those are things. So tradition, that's what it has been done. But like I mentioned, you visit farms, they're still talking about ketosis. They're treating a lot of cows, and they're like asking, like, when do I should check? Are those cows that we have a lot of cows who have BHB, but they don't look sick. They produce a lot of milk. Are they truly sick? And try to show some data supporting that. Probably not. So the first question we had, and this is truly based on practitioners and producers' comments, is like, when do I test for BHB? So we went to, in this case, one farm here in Minnesota, and we tested cows in week 1 and week 2. So we were there once a week, and we tested any cow that was between day 3, day 2, and day 8, and then day 9 and day 16. And if they have high BHB, they were considered to have hyperketonemia in this case, either in week 1 or week 2. So from the 20%, 25% of the cows that will be positive, we divided them into the ones that have hyperketonemia or ketosis in the first week, the ones that had in the second week. And we also had some very few of them that had ketosis in both weeks. They were high BHB, and those cows that we have here, they were not treated. So if they have high BHB, they stayed, and if the cow had high BHB first week, not in the second week, she got better on her own without any treatment. For the analysis, I'm not going to show any cows that had high BHB in both weeks because we didn't have enough animals. So it's really hard to make any inferences from those results. But what we found, and I'll try to make it very simple, is when we look into milk production, you can see that the cows here that had hyperketonemia in the first week compared to the cows that did not have hyperketonemia in the first week, the hyperketonemia cows produce less milk. And if you go on the second, cows that were diagnosed in the second week, you don't see a difference. And the way you're going to read these graphs here, the next 3 slides, is the line in the middle is actually the estimate for each group, and the shaded part next to it, it's our confidence interval. So if you look in the confidence interval and they're not overlapping, there's some white in between, that means that they're different. So here you can see that there is a difference in the first week. So for milk production, for example, cows that have hyperketonemia, they have an 8% decline in their milk production in a 305 days lactation. So it's equivalent to 1,100, just over 2,000 pounds per cow in the first lactation. There is also some difference about, here would be about 1,000 pounds per cow on the cows diagnosed the second week. However, that difference, statistically, we cannot differentiate between the groups. When we looked into the time to get pregnant for those cows, and the way to read those graphs would be, this is the survival or the cows not pregnant. They always start lactation not pregnant. And as time goes by, we inseminate them and they start getting pregnant. And if a cow gets pregnant, the curve ticks down. And as the fastest, the closest to the y-axis, the line is, the fastest that group of cows got pregnant. And then what you see here is, if we look at the cows that were hyperkatonemic in the first week versus the ones that were healthy, which are the green, you can see that the ones that did not have hyperketonemia got pregnant faster than those ones that have hyperketonemia. And that wasn't the case for second week of the lactation animals. So what we found was those cows having hyperketonemia in the first week, they were about 21 days. They got pregnant about 21 days later than the not hyperketonemia cows. So that's always, both results are showing that hyperketonemia in the first week does have an influence on those outcomes, while hyperketonemia in the second week doesn't play a greater role on this differences in production outcomes. And here, continue with the same trend. We're looking into herd removal, and what we can see here, going back to the bottom line here, is that cows that have hyperketonemia in the first week compared to the ones that did not have it, they were almost 2.5 times high risk of being removed from the herd up to 300 days than those quote-unquote healthy cows. Same, the proportions, if they were the second week, we couldn't find a difference that was statistically significant. So altogether, this showing that if the hyperketonemia or the ketosis is diagnosed in week 1, that's what's associated with this negative performance. And there was no evidence that there are detected on the second week being the ones that associated with this negative outcome. So practical knowledge is, if you're testing for hyperketonemia, if you need to look for it, look in the first week postpartum, as you're going to find the ones that are the ones that are causing the worst results for your animals. And just like to try to understand, we try to go into more of the specifics and the mechanisms of it. So this is a project from my former grad student that it's under review, but we can we look into the dry period and get blood from those cows 21 days prepartum and see if we can predict those cows that will have hyperketonemia postpartum. So we collect blood from them 21 days prepartum and run a complete amino acid profile and complete biochemistry. And what we found, the results were, if a cow had hyperketonemia in the first week, what we found, even as a dry cow, we found evidence that there were changes that were associated with fatty liver dysfunction and fatty liver biomarkers for those cows. For the cows that were in the second week, that developed hyperkalemia in the second week, we didn't find any evidence of changes on any biomarkers prepartum. So it's telling us here, those cows in the first week that has hyperkalemia diagnosed the first week, they probably already have some issues transitioning before. And that goes back to what I mentioned. If we go treat test cows to make changes in our management, we're going to do management out here, because then we're picking up those cows that already have some changes that are happening, and hopefully we could revert it. Depends on what we do for those cows. And then in this set of cows, we actually check if they have both hyperkalemia on both time points, first and second week. They have evidence of changes in biomarkers related to gluconeogenesis, ketogenesis, and fatty liver and liver dysfunction. So that gives us yet more evidence showing, like, yes, first week definitely something that it is associated with those poor outcomes. And if you look before it, it's also evident that there is some changes that are happening even earlier during the dry period, leading those cows to have those issues. Then a second question, try to go quite fast here, is just exploring, like, does all cows with hyperketonemia, are they all the same? Like, is it a disease? All the cows will do poorly. So what we did is, again, this time we went to 6 different farms up here in up Midwest and tested cows. And in this case, we still did week 1 and week 2 because we didn't know what we know now, that week 1 should be the best time for us to test. And then we separated them into hyperketonic or not. But the hyperketonic one, the ketosis ones, we use data on their milk yield as a proxy for their being healthy or not. So if a cow is considered to be healthy, it should be producing a lot of milk. And the cows that are not producing a lot of milk were considered to not be healthy. And then we added those two, hyperketonemia and milk yield. And then we have basically 3 groups. Hyperketonemia cows with high milk production, which is the 75th percentile. Hyperketonemia cow with low milk production with the below 25th percentile. And we have hyperketonemia cows in the middle between 25 and 75 percentile. And then basically what we did, unfortunately, with the design we have, we cannot really measure milk production because that's one of our predictors. It doesn't, our results will be biased based on that. But if we look into the reproductive performance per se, what we see is the high yield cows and mid yield cows, it doesn't matter if they have hyperketonemia or not. They are all about the same. Within each category, they will stay the same. However, when we look into those low yielding cows, which, just to remind you, it's what we consider the poor doers, and then they have high DHB on top of that, they are hyperketonemic, then we see that those cows, as we discussed before, they take longer to get pregnant. So they start all open, want to start breeding. Those cows, they were hyperketonemic, but they were also not producing a lot of milk. So poor doers, more than just having the high DHB, they take longer to get pregnant than their non-hyperketonemic cows. So what's showing here, and this data set, I played with it in different ways, and I look into this data set before as just positive and negative, one versus the other, and we see that classic curve that the negative cows do better than the positive cows. But then when you start splitting into different categories within that positive ketotic cows, you see that not all the cows are the same. And some of them, the poor doers, they do very poorly, and they drag the average to be worse than the non-hyperketonemic cows. So the message here is just showing that there's different cows within the hyperketonemic group that'll do worse on the other, or not, depending on how their overall health. So just to exemplify here, based on that curve, it's hard for you to tease out numbers out of it. But if we compare what we consider would be considered the healthy cows, so high producing cows and not hyperketonemia, versus the ketosis cows that's not producing well, so the poor doer of ketosis, we have about 21 days or one cycle difference in their time to get pregnant. And if you look into the same group, the comparison, and like how many, the proportion of them that are pregnant by 150 days, we'll see a 44% lower risk for those cows that have hyperketonemia and are poor doers. So, and on the other hand, when we look into also other hyperketonemic cows, they are performing pretty close to the cows that do not have hyperketonemia. So there is a difference into our cows that have hyperketonemia or ketosis, and there is a group of them, potentially 25% of them, they're in really bad shape and really at risk, while 75% of them, they have high BHB, but they're probably just mobilizing more fat and using that to produce more milk. So what we learned from those is that not all hyperketonemia are the same. The cow's overall health tell us a lot about the ones that have a problem with hyperketonemia and the ones that don't. Some practical knowledge is we can measure those things and monitor it based on blood or urine. But the one thing that it's hard to find, but if we all could have it, having good cow people is still essential. It's still something that we need to have at the farm, and it's very helpful. And just maybe for a future webinar, we're starting a clinical trial to test the hypothesis that not all hyperketonemia is the same. We might be able to treat them differently. And hopefully in the next 12 to 18 months, we'll have some results to share with all of you on that. And then this is like really short, and just something that we're looking at lately. We have been, and I talked a lot here about this 1.2 millimoles per liter cutoff point. And we use that to determine if it's positive or negative. But it is, measuring cows, we measure anything from 0.3 to 6.5 or whatever very large number that we can get. So why we're looking into cutoffs, when we do that, the reason is it's much easier for us to understand positive and negative and the outcomes. And it's really hard to make assumptions or inferences from a continuous number. But what I want to show with this is if we look into the concentration as a continuous variable, if we look in the first week when I said like there's a problem, right? So we plotted like continuously, so 0.1, 0.2, all the way to the largest number we have here, which is about like around 5. And we plot like what's the milk production in week 4, or peak milk production for those animals, if we have that. And we found out that basically what we're finding is it's about the highest milk production in week 4 will be those cows about 1. But if you look, the peak milk production is the cows that had in week 1 BHB around 1.9. So here the curves from first, second, and third lactation. all these graphs, and it's just showing us that the cutoff we have, 1.2, it's actually below what the high producing cows have. So there is some cows that can mobilize and they have a lot of circulating ketone bodies, and they do well with those. They can cope with it and still producing a lot of milk. When we look into the second week, which is like what we talked before, that it's a little bit different. Those are cows that are probably just using that BHB to produce milk. The results are even more interesting, because you have the cows that are producing the most in their 4th week of lactation. Their BHB, it's about 1.6, and it's again 1.9 to 2 millimoles per liter for peak milk production. So by having a cutoff that's 1.2 and treating a lot of cows, we might be over-treating some cows. So that's why we're trying to optimize some of the protocols these days, is just to find out what's the best time for us to, or the best cutoff to use for those treatments. So what these numbers that we still preliminary that we're working, it just means that this quadratic effect or this curvilinear association we find is very low BHB and very high BHB is associated with poor milk production, but high, like intermediate BHB, which is moderate in the middle, which is somewhat above what the cutoff is saying now, is associated with the higher milk production. So this is something to keep us thinking, get us thinking, and challenge some of the protocols we have nowadays. And then just trying to summarize and wrap up now is practically for your farm, for your clients, only nervous ketotic cows should need IV dextrose. We shouldn't be giving dextrose IV to a ketotic cow if they don't have any clinical sign. If we are monitoring ketosis, we should do that for cows in the 1st week, as this is related to the worst outcomes. Blood and urine tests are good, but if you have good people, cow people in your barn, that's helpful, because can tells you like, yes, she has high BHB, but she's likely not sick. So many times you go to a farm, talk to people, it's like, we're gonna treat her for ketosis because she has high BHB, but then they agree with you that she has good full udder, and she came back from the parlor and she ate everything that was in front of her. So those cows don't look sick. They're not really sick. So we just need to be now, it's like challenge ourselves and try to not feel bad because we're not treating because we think that she has a disease, but that's actually not a disease. It's just how she is adapting to the lactation. And lastly, like both high and low BHB are associated with low milk production. So we want the cows to have a certain level of BHB circulating because they need that to support their milk production. And with that, I'm a little bit over, but I still would like to thank the Dairy Podcast team for the invitation. Acknowledge all the sponsors that we have through the years that allow me to do this work. All the team here at University of Minnesota that actually do a lot of the grunt work and the work boots on the ground with me and without me in my place. And we have some of social media handles and website addresses if you want to get in touch with me. And I see there were some questions, and I'll be happy to answer some questions.
Well, thanks so much, Luciano, for an excellent presentation and really challenging the audience here to think a bit outside of the box, challenge the status quo. I recall the theme of an ABP conference a number of years ago, what we know that isn't so. And I think every day we need to look back and think of, what we do to cattle. For great example is, treating every case of ketosis with dextrose. What is the impact of locking up that cow, putting a needle in her neck, potentially getting some dextrose outside of the vein, and and then she's not eating for the next few days because we over-treated a cow that in the beginning didn't even need a treatment. So, thanks for getting the audience to, again, think outside of the box a bit. Your take-home points really bring forth things that folks can do today or tomorrow morning differently when in the fresh pen. So I think that's really relevant, and challenge everyone to think about ketosis and subclinical ketosis, clinical and subclinical differently, and what's really a disease. So it looks like we have some great questions here. So we'll move right along with those to get some audience participation here. One of the questions is regarding rumen-protected choline and its role in preventing diseases such ketosis. So what can you comment there, Luciano?
Yeah, so if I didn't go very much into details on my first slides, that we have a liver and like all the pathways they go through. And the one pathway that I didn't talk about was the VLDL pathway, which is something that the choline helps a lot in the export of VLDL, right? So, and that comes before the cows have a lot of fatty liver and liver dysfunction. So there is a potential for choline being there because the choline is helping with overall liver function. And then liver, again, I didn't want to go very deep into physiology, but liver is producing all the glucose that the cow is using for milk production. And the glucose is important for milk production because it goes through the sugar, lactose, that drives milk production. So the liver is very important in that early lactation. It's important for our cows, but especially in early lactation to produce that glucose. So the choline will help, not because it's getting to on the glucose pathway, but it's allowing the cow to have a better capacity to have that glucose pathway. It's kind of like not the best way to explain it, but it's just protecting, quote unquote, the liver to just be more effective on its function, which is producing glucose. So that would be the very short answer, not physiological, like really depth answer to that choline response.
Okay, and then based on the available research, that's a public. What would your recommendation be in general? That is a supplement to feed pre and post calving, as many herds do.
Yeah, like on that 3 weeks before, 3 weeks after time. So it's easier on the pre, right? And that's very convenient for farms because that usually coincides with your close-up and your fresh pen, right? So your close-up diet and your fresh diet have it because it's fairly expensive, and you start it'll be interesting to see how it is if you use it throughout lactation, but it might be cost prohibitive. So if you have folks, definitely focus on those cows. Those are we've seen, and there has a lot of evidence showing that there is a benefit for it, and those are the cows that the liver is definitely under the most pressure.
Great, and that's a great point, Luciano. Bringing up the economics, right? There's research to show that many products have a benefit, but we need to look at the cost result benefit, the return on that product. So it's not to say that some of these strategies don't work, but what are the economics to also feed any supplements or implementing these strategies? Excellent. The next question is in terms of technology for the future, research and technology. And I know there's some projects that we're working on jointly with you and your team, but what can you comment on given future technologies?
Yeah, specific. I don't know if it's specific for ketosis, but I'll try to have it because the question is not focused, but I'll do ketosis and also overall. We're looking at, like as you mentioned, Mark, jointly on projects on potentially using rumination data to show to use that as a proxy for cow being healthy or not, right? So to a point that I would like to get to a point where I see I gotta look into rumination and I would not rely 100% on it, but rely 95% on rumination, and I would only look and allocate my fresh pen crew to look into cows that have some alert, that has like some rumination deviation. They're not ruminating well, because that's a good proxy of this cow not doing well overall. And then we're looking specific to ketosis is like, I showed some data like the high producing cows that have high BHP, they produce well. They have good repro. So we're looking now into, can I use this high rumination time, or the ones that are ruminating appropriately, even if they have high BHP? The hypothesis is those cows have high BHP likely because they're producing a lot, and they still cannot eat as much as they should, but they're mobilizing their body reserves, and they can use it efficiently and put that into milk without getting sick. So not having low rumination help them not be sick. So this is one way we're looking at it. I'm trying to doing some workouts in the technology, specifically rumination, to optimize this fresh pen management and optimize the use of labor. I think that's something that's there. There are other technology that we see out there with camera, and they call computer vision. They will be body condition scoring animals automatically, so you can see what's the change in body condition score, which will help us fine-tune nutrition management. And then there's every other week you see a different monitoring device that can be on the farm, and I think there's a lot of room for that, especially with the labor shortage, to use that to our advantage. And there's a lot of people in the research side in the industry working to understand better and like make the information produced by those systems usable, and something that can be translated to different management strategies. So I'm a full believer on the use of technology. I know the capital cost involved in getting that to be functional, but it's getting cheaper and it can be very effective. So I don't know if I answer it. Maybe it was more a very academic like answer, not to the point, but try to encompass everything.
I think that's perfect, and also the relevance of what are we going to do with these results, right? If we have the data, okay, now what management change we going to do based on that data, and having that confidence that we have good results and we can actually do something different based on those results. Excellent. So really then kind of flowing into that, these technologies that can give us some more information. One of the questions is, what are some simple but yet effective management strategies to prevent or reduce the incidence of ketosis that you have seen on farms that you work with?
And it'll be big ones that's easy, right? Like low stocking density, good heat abatement, and those are the big ones. Like those, like that way the cow has not stress. She's not in stress. She's eating enough, and they usually transition well. The other thing that it's interesting because we talk about this, and to properly answer this question, I need to ask whoever asked this is like, are you looking into high BHB or like BHB over 1.2 as your disease? Because what I was trying to show with some data is like, it's not. Like some cows, they have high BHB. We consider them to be sick, but they are not. Like they're doing well. They just have a different makeup. Their metabolism is different, right? So maybe if we do something that you just thinking about decreasing BHB, will be actually impairing some of those cows to produce as much milk as they are right now. But this is something that is some ideas and some concepts that is challenging some of the things that have been done and talked in the industry for too long, like for the last few decades. and we're still trying to understand. So big things. I really like Dr. Gordy Jones' quote that milk production is the lack or the absence of stress on the life of a cow. And those are the things that I said, like if we have no stress with the cow, they will produce more milk. And I bet you that some of them, I don't know a percentage, but some of them will have high BHB and they're not sick. So it's hard. Like right now we're trying to understand what's truly a healthy cow, more than just the BHB, or because the BHB we can find in a healthy cow and in a sick cow. So it's hard, but big things, decreasing stress, and I'll say stocking density, proper diet. I think that's a given that I didn't even mention, and heat abatement, which we should have been working on this for the last 2 months. We're having heat stress here in Minnesota this week, so everybody else got it for 2 months already.
No, great point, Luciano, and it gets back to the basics, right? Low stress, plenty of feed available, and that cow's going to strive. And then certainly, we look similarly, a whole nother webinar, but subclinical hypocalcemia post-calving, those are our highest producing cows. So again, for the audience, just thinking outside of the box of what we think we know about diseases, which maybe aren't really diseases, but are adaptive processes, metabolic processes that the cow has to, maybe we don't even know why, right? To support milk production, to support that transition on her own. So, let the cow be a cow. So those are all the questions from the audience here. I guess any others? The chat is open, so we'll give a few seconds here for any other. It looks like a few more have popped up here.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Mark, I was just going to say, like, I don't know if, like, I'm happy to stay longer, but we are over time, and I don't want to take too much time from other people. I'll be happy to answer this. I'll be happy to answer them via email or a different way if that'll be better for the audience. But I'm available.
Okay. So we'll wrap up with one last question here. This, I think, a take home is, should we drench cows with propylene glycol over 1.5 BHB, or wait till they have a clinical sign? So we'll wrap up with that.
So right now, my recommendation right now is I don't have scientific data and evidence to tell you do not treat those cows. That's why I'm working right now in the summer and since the spring and the summer is to try to create evidence to say for sure treat or not treat those cows based on other parameters. But right now, I'll say yes, treat those cows. And some preliminary data that I see, some of those cows, if you just think about high or low BHB, if you don't treat them, they don't produce as much as the cows that were treated. However, like I said, like on the data set, I think we can tease out which those cows are, and which are the ones that need treatment. But right now, I don't have the evidence to tell you not to do it. So I'll go with what has been proven scientifically that those cows truly, they'll do better if they're treated. So I'll say yes, treat them, but hopefully I'll be coming back in 6 months to a year and tell you maybe not all of them, but I cannot, I don't feel as a scientist, I don't feel comfortable telling you not to treat some of the cows because I still have to tease that out.
Great. So that's a primer for everyone to stay tuned for a future webinar with Dr. Luciano Cascetta. So once again, thanks to everyone. Luciano, thanks for the great presentation, really gathering this information, not only your own research, but other research to present to our audience today. Also want to thank the Wycinetics team for putting this together, and all the backstage people who contribute to this, getting this off to the ground, from the invitations to running the program today. And keep in mind the Dairy Podcast Show. There's well over, I think, 37 episodes right now. They come out on a regular basis. Some really good content there when you're driving around or have some time. A great opportunity to tune in on Spotify or your other applications. So with that, Dr. Caschetta, any final messages to our audience before we wrap up?
No, thank you for their podcast team, Wysenetics, and people for participating. I'll be happy to answer questions. Like I said, they have my contact was in the slides. Feel free to shoot me an email, and I'll ask the Wysenetics team to. I see that a couple questions that we didn't answer. If they forward it to me, I'll send a note with my thoughts on. But yeah, it was great to participate. Feel free to reach out, and it's nice. Send us questions. As researchers, I want to know what are your questions, what you see on the field, because that's what drives my program.
Excellent. Thanks again, Dr. Caschetta. Thanks again to our audience, Wysenetics team, and we look forward to future webinars. Take care.